Okay, we're going to make a start. I probably should have swallowed the cookie before saying that. We're going to make a start in the second session. So, in the first session, then we looked at those three arguments from our atheist friends and thought about how to respond and how to share the gospel. This second session, we're going to take a look at just one big argument and really explore the idea of whether atheism is itself a belief system. And I think this is hugely important because it's my conviction, and I think it's thoroughly scriptural. Everyone does with convictions, right? But I think it's thoroughly scriptural that everybody has belief commitments and faith commitments and worldview commitments. Our atheist friends don't tend to think they do, and so I think it's important to address that. And what I want to do this morning is I want to start actually by reading you a short section from a book I wrote 2 or 3 years ago, The Atheist Didn't Exist. The reason for doing that is every author likes to engage in shameless plugs, so you're going to get a 2-minute shameless plug. But also, the question of whether or not atheism is a belief system is the question that really drove this book. I got fed up of atheist friends saying to me, Andy, I don't believe anything. It's you, Christians, who believe things. You have to defend what you believe. Atheism is just the absence of belief in God, and so I have nothing to defend. And I got very frustrated with that argument, and I found myself thinking, there's something wrong with it. I couldn't work out why, and that became the very first chapter I wrote for this book, $8.99 where all good books are sold, and $8.99 where bad books are sold as well, actually, but there we are. So I just want to read you this, and then we'll get into the more serious stuff. So chapter 2 of the book, I begin by sort of describing a rather strange dialogue with a friend of mine at a coffee shop, and my friend announced to me, he said, "I don't believe that Sweden exists." My friend suddenly announced from across the coffee shop table, "There, I finally said it." And he took a long sip of coffee and stared fiercely at me, daring me to respond. I paused for a moment to think. My cinnamon roll halfway to my mouth as I digested what he just said. "Pardon? Sweden doesn't exist," he said. "Seriously," I said, you don't believe in Sweden?" "That's right," said my friend, warming to his theme. "It's obvious when you think about it. Sweden is just a political conspiracy, invented to motivate other European citizens to work harder. All that talk of the best healthcare system, the highest standard of living, a land of tall, svelte, and beautiful people. Come on, it sounds more and more like a myth the more you hear about it. I am not fooled. I do not believe in Sweden." I stared at my friend silently, allowing the sounds of the coffee shop to drift over us for a few seconds while I pondered. In the background, the radio began playing Dancing Queen by ABBA. "You're insane," I finally said. If Sweden doesn't exist, how do you explain IKEA furniture? Or the Swedish chef on the Muppet Show, or what glues Norway to Finland? It's a staggering claim. Where is your evidence? "Evidence?" my friend said. "Yes, evidence. You surely have more than just a hunch and a bunch of prejudices, but some pretty impressive evidence for your belief. I realize that Sweden has only 9 million inhabitants and more moose than men, but you can't just deny outright it exists." "Ah," said my friend knowingly, "I see your problem." "My problem?" I said, "Yes, your problem," he said. "In fact, your confusion. You think my denial of Sweden is an actual claim of some kind, that it's a belief. But it's not, it's a non-belief. There's nothing I need to explain. Rather, I'm just talking about something I lack. I lack a belief in Sweden, and so I don't need to give evidence for it." "Come again?" I said. "Yes," he said, warming to his theme. "I don't have to provide evidence for my non-belief in Atlantis, or El Dorado, or Shangri-La, or the customer support department at Ryanair, and nor need I for my non-belief in Sweden. I'm not making a claim of any kind. In fact, the opposite. I'm claiming nothing. I'm just merely rejecting one of your beliefs, your belief in Sweden. Now, quit arguing and pass me another cinnamon roll." Now, while that dialogue was entirely fictional, of course, the response I got when I pressed my friend on his lack of belief in Sweden has a real-world parallel, especially in the way that some atheists like to talk about their lack of belief in God. And this is how the argument sometimes goes, right? Atheism is a disbelief in God, and therefore you don't need to give reasons for it. And the assumption is that atheism is purely negative, and it's only positive arguments that you have to give reasons for. So, for example, if I claim to you that I have there's Sweden. If I claim to you I have a pet unicorn called Derek, who lives in my garden and gives free rides to my children and the neighborhood children, you can ask me to provide evidence, right? But if I say my garden is devoid of mythical horned creatures, I don't need to give evidence, right? So here's the question. Is atheism just the absence of belief in God? If that's all it is, then our atheist friends are right. It's like the absence of unicorns in my garden. They don't have to give any reasons. Or is atheism more than that? Well, certainly many atheists think that atheism is merely the absence of belief in God, and therefore they can be absolutely lazy. Let me give you a flavour for this. So Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, famously said this: "Our belief is not a belief." I confess I once tried a similar argument to my wife when I forgot our wedding anniversary. My forgetfulness is not forgetfulness. It didn't work then, and I'm not sure Hitchens fares much better, but he's not alone. Recently, one of the evangelistic young atheists who flock around me on Twitter like moths around a candle flame, they often sort of lob atheist zingers in my direction, tweeted this to me on Twitter recently. He said, "Atheism isn't a claim. It's just non-belief in the claim there is a God." Now, I've heard variations of this thousands of times. Maybe you've heard similar kind of ideas in the culture. And rhetorically, it's very clever, because if atheism is just a non-belief, if it's just the absence of belief in God, then you don't need to defend it, right? Our atheist friends can sit there and throw stones at everybody else and not have to actually defend anything. A bit like my Sweden-denying friend in the coffee shop, he can just sit there and refuse to give reasons and say they're not claiming anything. It's a very clever move. It's also a very poor move because, like a Swiss cheese, it is somewhat riddled with holes. Let me show you 6 problems with the idea that atheism is not a belief, and what reasons why I think that it is, and really show how I think we can level the playing field, which is all that really I want to do with my atheist friends. I want to convince them that they believe things, I believe things, and now we can talk about the things that we believe like normal people. Ideally in the coffee shop at IKEA, but there we are. Now, 6 problems with the belief that atheism isn't a claim. It's just a non-belief in the claim there is a God. Let's start with the first one. First problem is it proves too much. It proves way too much. If my atheist friend is right, and that atheism just means the absence of a belief in God, think what that would entail for a moment. It would mean, for example, my cat is an atheist because she does not believe in God. I sometimes think cats believe they are God, but that's a different question. Likewise, donuts, small rocks, the English Channel, the colour green, Richard Dawkins' left foot, these presumably are all atheists because they lack a belief in God. Now, when I say that to my atheist friends, the usual response is to say something like, "But a small rock can't believe anything." To which I then say, okay, so now you're saying that atheism is the lack of belief in God by a creature with the ability to form rational, coherent beliefs. Now that's a whole different level of claim. That's a positive claim. That's not a negative claim. That's now become a positive claim. And now my friend is admitting that he or she believes the external world exists, that other minds exist, that human beings can form beliefs and act upon them, and so on and so forth. And those are all positive beliefs. And I've never yet met an atheist who thinks that you can make a positive belief and not give evidence for it. In fact, atheists are fond of crying out, "Evidence, evidence, evidence, bring me the evidence," whenever they meet religious believers. And I say to my atheist friends, okay, I agree with you. We need to give evidence, but so do you. You need to give evidence for the positions that you hold. Otherwise, as an atheist, you can take your place with the cat, the rock, the colour green, and Richard Dawkins' left foot. So there we are. Now, moving rapidly on. Second problem with the idea that atheism is not a belief, it's just a non-belief in the claim there is a God, is it ends up this strange conundrum that atheism can't be true or false. It just has no value at all. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about it for a moment, it's only beliefs or claims that can be true or false. I'm going to give you a few examples. If I say it is raining today, it was in Edinburgh when I left. Simon Cowell is Prime Minister, Lord help us. The English cricket team has lost again. All of those are beliefs, they're claims. The last one might be, philosophers would say, a necessary claim, but there we are. And all those are claims, and we can test them. We can put them to the test, and they're either true or it's false. Either it's raining or it's not raining. Either Simon Cowell is Prime Minister or he isn't, and so on. But on the other hand, consider a different list of statements for a moment. Consider just the colour blue, Richard Dawkins' left foot, a small Czechoslovakian chartered accountant. What does it mean to ask if those are true? well, then they're meaningless. They're not truth claims. They don't possess a truth value. You wouldn't say blue is true or false. So now the question is, where does atheism belong? Does it belong, is it more like the top list in yellow, or is it more like the things on the bottom list in white? Well, as far as I can tell, my atheist friends think atheism is true. If someone says to me they're an atheist, and I say, okay, do you think your atheism is true? It describes reality. They'll go, yes, it's true. In which case it looks like one of the things up the top, quite frankly. And if it's not, then atheism is gibberish. To say you're an atheist is on a par with saying wibble, 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 wibble. If you're a Blackadder fan, you can stick two pencils up your nose and wear your underpants on your head while doing that, to those of you who wanted to. Oh, thank you, one or two people who got that reference. Blackadder goes forth, final episode, I believe. Now, there we are. Now, if my atheist friends, I say, wish to join the conversation sensibly, and I believe that atheism deserves its place at the discussion table as much as any other worldview, then we need to encourage our atheist friends to take themselves more seriously, recognize their belief for what it is, and act accordingly. So that's the second issue. Third problem with the claim that atheism isn't a claim, it's just a non-belief in the claim there is a God, is the fact that only beliefs cause actions. This is a little bit philosophical, but I think we can bear with me, because I think we can illustrate it quite practically. Only actual beliefs, philosophers would say, actually cause actions. And let me illustrate what I mean with some examples. If you turn the ignition key on your Toyota, that causes the engine to start. If you drop a sledgehammer on your foot, that causes pain. And touching the screen of your iPod causes an ABBA song to begin playing through the headphones. That also causes pain, incidentally. On the other hand, non-existent keys and non-existent sledgehammers and non-existent iPods don't cause anything. For something to cause something, it has to actually exist. That's not actually rocket science in one sense, although to some of my atheist friends it would appear to be. And the same goes for beliefs. For something to actually cause something, that belief has to have substantive quality. Let me show you what I mean. I don't believe there's a hippo in my bathroom. I guess many of you don't believe there's a hippo in your bathroom unless you live in very interesting houses, and in which case life is very interesting for you. But no, I don't believe there's a hippo in my bathroom right now. And my absence of a belief in hippos in my bathtub has never caused me to do anything. That belief, that non-belief, has never done a thing. Equally, I don't believe in the Tooth Fairy or, in fact, in Father Christmas, and neither of those beliefs has caused me to do anything. My absence of belief in Santa Claus doesn't affect my life. My absence of belief in the Tooth Fairy, cute as she is, doesn't cause anything. For something to cause actions, it has to be a positive belief. So what about atheism? Does atheism cause anything, or is it up there with hippos and bathtubs? Well, atheism appears to cause lots of things, actually. Atheism causes lots of internet-dwelling young atheists to spend hundreds of hours reading skeptical websites, or editing Wikipedia articles, or writing angry blogs, or frequenting atheist discussion groups, or annoying Christians on Twitter, as happens to me most days. Those look like actions, quite frankly. The same applies offline, too. I know many atheists who attend conferences. They buy T-shirts. They fix comedy bumper stickers to the rear end of their Toyotas. I don't know if anyone's seen the little Darwin fish thing designed. It seems to be designed to annoy Christians. To me, that looks like intelligent design, which actually would seem to be an argument for... I said that once to an atheist who got very angry. I was like, that's a great argument for God, because if I saw that fish, I'd be going, there's a creator, but there we go. And other people, of course, like Richard Dawkins, their atheism has caused them to write books. What was it that caused Richard Dawkins to spend hundreds of hours slaving over a hot word processor, typing up that book and editing it? Presumably it was caused by his atheism. And what caused hundreds and thousands, in fact tens of thousands, of enthusiastic young skeptics to go out and buy it? Well, causing, if not much rejoicing in heaven, certainly much rejoicing in Dawkins' bank. What caused all that? Well, presumably it was atheism. And so what I want to say to my atheist friends, if atheism is just a non-belief, a non-thing, a mere absence, it looks incredibly busy, quite frankly. And so anyone who tells you that atheism is just the absence of belief in God, I think they're having a laugh, quite frankly, and they're out of touch with reality. So 3 reasons down, 3 more to go, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. Fourth thing I want to suggest to you is that beliefs have entailments. What do I mean by this? Well, another hallmark of a real, actual existing thing is it has entailments. Things change if you believe it. So, for example, if you believed, for example, that Nigel Farage would make the best Prime Minister, that will affect, Lord help you, how you might vote at the next election. No one's laughing. Oh dear, we've got a whole UKIP audience here today. Never mind. I spend too much time in Oxford where I do the joke the other way around. Now, if I don't believe that Sweden exists, actually, if I believe that Sweden doesn't exist, well, that has some entailments, right? That entails the need to find a new source of cheap pine furniture, meatballs, and gravelux, along with the need to redraw the map of Northern Europe. So if a sign of an actual belief is it has an impact in the real world, it has consequences, it has entailments, what about atheism? Does anything follow? Does anything change? Is anything impacted if you believe there is no God? Well, according to one of the most famous atheists of the last 200 years, Friedrich Nietzsche, also possessor of the most impressive moustache in the history of philosophy, that is quite a tash, the answer is a resounding yes. So Nietzsche was a committed, ardent, passionate atheist, but he recognized there were some implications of his atheism. He wrote this. Nietzsche said, when one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the rights to Christian morality out from under one's feet. This morality is by no means self-evident. Christianity is a system, a whole view of things thought out together. And by breaking one main concept out of it, the faith in God, one breaks the whole. Nothing necessary remains in one's hands. And so Nietzsche is basically saying here is that if you dig out the foundations of your house, dynamite the cellar, remove the foundations, then the walls and the roof will collapse because they are dependent on foundations. And likewise, he says the same is true of God. There are many things that stand upon belief in God. The idea that human beings have innate value and dignity, that we are not just a random collection of atoms, but human beings with value and dignity and worth. And of course, ethics and law and modern human rights theory are based on this idea. But where does that idea come from? Well, if you trace the history of human rights or the history of the modern Western legal system, or go and explore the wellspring of ethics, you'll see it comes from the Bible, especially the biblical teaching in Genesis 1 that human beings are made in the image of God. And so what Nietzsche is saying, and I admire his courage, he's one of my favorite atheist writers because he's willing to go there. He's willing to say, look, reject God by all means, throw God out, declare that God is dead, but then you have to start again, explaining why one particular creature, one accident of evolution possesses human rights and value and dignity, whereas ants and aardvarks and eggplants and cockroaches and mice and estate agents don't, for example. I know, I got the pastor's backstory here, so I'm picking on Phil wherever he is. Now, he's not alone. So the novelist and atheist Llewellyn Powys, who's not so well known, but is a brilliant atheist writer, and again quite bleak and stark and willing to recognize the consequences here, this is what Llewellyn Powys writes. He says, the atheist must be bold, to weave a bower of endless night upon the very edge of the abyss, on the very edge of the abyss of abysses. This precarious cat's cradle he must make his intellectual habitation. It is not only belief in God that must be abandoned, not only all hope of life after death, but all trust in an ordained moral order. We must be prepared to take our bearings without a compass and with a slippery deck of our life vessels sliding away underneath our feet. Dogmatic nihilists, profoundly skeptical of all good, we are put to our resources like shipwrecked seamen. We have no sense of direction, and we recognize without dispute that all beyond the margin of our own scant moment is lost. Cheerful, bleak stuff, but honest. And if Powys is right, if Nietzsche is right, they're saying atheism has some entailments. If you are an atheist, then you have to recognize that life is meaningless, utterly meaningless. Nihilism follows. And the fact that atheism entails this tells me that atheism is a belief. Because how could a non-belief, a non-thing, a mere absence, mere ephemera, cause such drastic consequences? This looks like atheism is a thing, and a pretty scary thing, if Powys and Nietzsche, both atheists, are right. So, 4 down, and then 2 to go, and then we'll apply some of this and have time for some questions. Our 5th penultimate issue, reason why atheism can't just be a non-belief, is that beliefs attract other beliefs. that's a hallmark of beliefs, actually, that beliefs exist, as it were, in constellations, just like the stars do. For example, if I believe that learning the cello takes time and effort, then I will probably believe it's important to save money up for music lessons. Those two things are connected. So my musical preferences will affect my economic behavior and so forth. As an aside, actually, I did learn the cello for 3 years, from the age of 11 to the age of 14, because I discovered that if I took it up a musical instrument, it got me out of playing rugby in the winter. And also the cello teacher was 23 years old and a gorgeous brunette. And as an 11-year-old, I was like, I could do rugby out there, or I could learn the cello with you. And then after 3 years, they replaced her with a fat, hairy Russian guy, and that was my musical my musical career was over, and I chose the chess team. So, yeah, and similarly, my belief in God is a good example. So I believe in God that has related beliefs. I believe certain things about who Jesus was. I believe certain things about the purpose of life, about justice, values, duties, and so on. Beliefs attract other beliefs. They don't exist on their own. They exist together. So what about atheism? Does the statement, I don't believe in God, stand alone, stark and naked and proud? Or does it attract other beliefs? Does it, as it were, have a gravitational pull, pulling other beliefs into existence with it? Well, it's easy to show that atheism rarely exists on its own. Most atheists also believe in naturalism. That's the worldview that says only material things exist, tables and chairs and penguins and chocolate biscuits and so forth, and other exciting things. So most atheists are naturalists. They believe that only material things exist. And most, as we saw earlier, actually, in the first talk, people like Harry Croto and Brian Cox and others believe in what's called scientism, and that's the belief that science explains everything. And as you dig deeper, you discover that's not an accident. Those things are fueled by atheism. If you don't believe there's a God, you are much more highly likely to believe that physics and chemistry and biology can explain everything. And you're also likely to leap onto materialism, to naturalism, as a way to push God out of the door. And so it's not an accident those things connect together. So what does that tell us, that atheism attracts these other beliefs around it? Well, so a little modern scientific parable for you. One of the methods that astronomers use, folks at NASA and elsewhere, use to detect distant planets too far beyond the realm of our telescopes, is they use a technique called Doppler spectroscopy, which sounds very complicated. I prefer the more common title. It's known as the wobble method. What's the wobble method? Sounds like some kind of health plan. Well, as the planet orbits its star, far out in the galaxy, gravity causes the star that the planet is orbiting around to wobble slightly. And we can see the star kind of blip to and fro like this, just in our telescopes. And that tells us there's a planet out there. And I remember when I first read that and heard actually a friend at Oxford who's an astronomer give a lecture on this, I remember thinking, that's actually a helpful analogy for understanding atheism. Because despite Christopher Hitchens' protestations that our belief is not a belief, so many other beliefs are attracted into the orbit of atheism, as it were, that we can say, look, these other beliefs around it, causing atheism to fluctuate slightly, sort of tells us that there's a belief out here somewhere. So I think atheism, again, looks very much like a belief system. We can ask our atheist friends, therefore, to defend it. So, 5 reasons down. Last one to go, and I think in some ways, this is, for the non-philosophers in the room, probably the easiest to grasp, and in some ways one of the most important, actually. And it's that atheism functions as a belief system. Atheism functions as an identity marker. See, one of the hallmarks, I think, of beliefs is they function as identity markers. They become part of a person's identity, and non-beliefs don't do this. I mentioned earlier that I don't believe in the tooth fairy, for example, but I've never introduced myself at a party as an a-tooth-farian. Never tried that. Maybe I should go to wilder parties and try that, but I've never done that. I've never said, hi, I'm Andy, I'm an a-tooth-farian. There are not university groups for people who don't believe in Santa Claus. We foolishly taught my now 6-year-old daughter when she was 3 that Santa wasn't real. Good idea for Christian apologetics and, making sure that we tell her what's true. Bad idea because she then proceeded to tell all her other friends of that age, and we had lots of angry phone calls from parents that our daughter was going around telling other 3-year-olds there's no such thing as Santa Claus. It's funny, you could deny God in our culture, deny Santa Claus in public, and all hell breaks loose, but, there we go. I say all hell, I mean Santa is an anagram of Satan. I mean, there we get how conspiracy theories start. And nor, incidentally, move on, Bannister, move on. Nor are there annual conferences for people who don't believe in unicorns. So the lack of belief in the tooth fairy, lack of belief in Santa, lack of belief in unicorns, no one builds an identity around those things. But atheists do build their identity around their atheism. They introduce themselves as atheists. I get this to me all the time. People come up to me and say, "Hi Andy, I'm an atheist." I am often tempted to say, "Atheist tells me what you don't believe. What do you believe?" But they introduce themselves as atheists. They proudly write atheism in their social media profile, and the more enthusiastic ones change their profile picture on Facebook to pictures of the flying spaghetti monster and other kind of, atheist tropes. They gather together in groups, online, offline. They attend conferences, they buy books, they're even starting churches. We mentioned this before, the Sunday Assembly there in London and so forth. And so all of that raises the question then, if atheism is a non-belief, a non-thing, just an absence, how the heck can it form the kernel of someone's community, an identity? How can it form the basis of community, however tenuous? And I look at all this and all the other pieces of evidence, and I say to my atheist friends, isn't there a much more simpler hypothesis? Isn't it much simpler to say that atheism is a belief system? It's a belief. And therefore, just like other beliefs, ranging from the political to the religious, it can form part of your identity and even a community's identity. But if it's a belief, we need to defend it. In short, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, then it's time to fire up the barbecue and dig out the orange sauce out of the fridge, because whichever way you look at it, atheism looks like a belief, functions like a belief, behaves like a belief. It is a belief. Game over. But can we go further? Could we go further and describe some forms of atheism even as a religion? Could we do that? Well, some scholars think so. So Stephen Prothero of Boston University, not a Christian as far as I'm aware, wrote a fascinating book a few years ago, 8 years ago, called God is Not One. Amazing book actually exploring the question of, are all religions the same? And he concludes spectacularly, no, they're not. And he's coming at this as an anthropologist, not as a religious believer. But in his book on looking at different religions, his first chapter is on atheism. And this is what Stephen concludes. It's a lovely quote, because as I say, he's an agnostic, I think, if anything. And Stephen writes this. He says, atheism is a religion of sorts, or it certainly can be. Many atheists are quite religious, holding their views about God with the conviction of zealots and evangelizing with verve. It stands at the center of their lives, defining who they are, defining how they think, with whom they associate. The question of God is never far from their minds. Or as somebody else put it, no one talks so much about God as people who say they don't believe in him. Now, when I have suggested this to atheist friends, they usually get quite cross. There's usually a response along the lines of, do not be ridiculous. Atheists don't believe in God. How can atheism be a religion? Well, that's not a problem. There are plenty of religious people who don't believe in God, adherents of Buddhism, Confucianism, some forms of Judaism, and certain parts of the Anglican Church. I'm an equal opportunity offender. Now, to be religious doesn't mean to believe in God. To be religious doesn't mean to believe in God. So what does the word religion mean? Well, a very helpful definition was once offered by the sociologist Emile Durkheim. Very, very well-regarded sociologist. Again, I don't think a particular Christian background. And he defined religion this way. He said, religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things. And by sacred things, he's quite specific. He unpacks that term, sacred things. And he says sacred things means whatever a person holds dear. So that includes their values and their preferences, their ideas, and so forth. And it's therefore not difficult to see how atheism, especially with its temptation to worship and fetishize the sciences, fits that definition perfectly. But I do wonder if there's a better definition of the word religion, because this is what the question circles around. Because when you start asking what the word religion means, it becomes very problematic. It's a fascinating question when people say they're not religious, to say, what do you mean by religion? Because scholars can't agree on what the term religion means. Largely because religious experience is so diverse. How can you come up with one word that covers both Islam and Christianity and Judaism, deeply monotheistic, and on the other hand, covers New Age, paganism, Buddhism, and so forth. How can one word do all of that? And as also been pointed out, most people who follow a faith don't think of themselves as religious. I don't know about you, I think of myself as a follower of Jesus. I don't describe myself as religious. And my Muslim friends don't call themselves religious, they would call themselves Muslim, followers of Islam, and so forth. So how do we define the word religion in a way that's helpful? And as I've thought about this over the years, I think the one definition that I've come up with and cobbled together from other places that I think can maybe just begin to encompass the range of human religious experience and all the thousands of beliefs out there is this one. Religion is a system of belief that attempts to answer ultimate questions. Questions like, is there a God? Why are we here? How do we determine good and evil? What happens when we die? Now, what's interesting is even the most hard-nosed, materialistic, nihilistic atheist has answers to those questions. They would say, is there a God? No. How do we get here? Time plus chance plus natural selection. How do we determine right and wrong? Personal preference. What happens when we die? We are worm food, and so on. And so I think that definition fits things quite well. But let's just pick up that second question that I asked there for a few moments. Why are we here? That's an interesting question to ask oneself. And if I was to overrun this talk by half an hour, you'd all be asking yourself that question: why are we here, and how do we get out of here? Well, a few years ago, a psychologist, American psychologist called Roy Baumeister, wrote a fascinating book exploring that question: why are we here? He wrote a book called The Meanings of Life. And in that book, he argues that asking the question, why are we here, the meaning of life question, is actually so big that there are actually 4 other questions we need to address first. He says we need to address the question of identity. Who am I? We need to address the question of value. Do I matter? We need to address the question of purpose. Why am I here? And we need to address the question of agency. Can I make a difference? Can my life make a difference? Now, here things get fascinating, because not merely do atheists have to think about these questions too. Atheists have to answer the question, who am I? They have to answer the question, do I value? They have to answer the question, why am I here? And they have to answer the question, can my life make any difference, or should I just jump off the bridge now? Now, things get fascinating, because I think the religion of atheism fails to answer these 4 questions spectacularly. And let me just illustrate with 4 quotations, really, because time is short and I want to leave some time for some questions. So on the question of identity, what does it mean to be a human being? Francis Crick, one of the co-discoverers of the structure of DNA, one of the most famous molecular biologists of all times, and a committed atheist, wrote this. He said, on the question of what a human being is, he said, your joy and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are, in fact, nothing more, no more, than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you are nothing but a pack of neurons. Thank you for that, Francis. So in other words, you're just your atoms. Pretty bleak answer to the question of what is a human being. But some atheists can be even bleaker, because when it comes to the question of value, theoretical physicist and cosmologist Lawrence Krauss, good friend of Richard Dawkins, put it bluntly: we, human beings, are a 1% bit of pollution within the universe. We are completely insignificant. I actually really like that quotation because, being very kind of British, I often think I'm relatively insignificant. But I read that quote and went, thanks, Lawrence, I'm actually completely insignificant. That's kind of put me in my place. It's very good. But again, huge problems here, right? What are we as human beings? What's our value? Are we just mere scum on the surface of the cosmic pond? Or can we actually find a basis of value? And if this is true, then what's wrong with someone turning to someone else and behaving monstrously if human beings are just nothing more than cosmic pollution? So much for value. What about purpose? Is there any kind of purpose to human life? Well, on atheism, doesn't look like it, right? And in fact, here are the oft-quoted words of one of the most famous atheists of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell, who wrote a very famous essay reflecting on this problem of purpose for atheists. Let me read you what he says. He's quite wordy because he's a philosopher, which means he's paid by the syllable. But I still think you'll get the gist. He says, man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving. His origin, his growths, his hopes and his fears, his loves and his beliefs are nothing but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms. No fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave. All the labours of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and the whole temple of man's achievement must be buried, inevitably be buried, beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. I have often thought, if I had a time machine, I could go back in time and have a beer with any philosopher from history, I wouldn't pick Bertrand, because it would be quite a grim evening. But he's honest. This is the future. It all ends in the flames at the end of the universe. You know, you will die, your children will die. One day the human race will become extinct. One day the sun will expand and swallow the earth. One day the universe itself will end empty and dark and cold and alone and, you know, universe in ruins and worthless, just like Belgium. And there we are. See, equal opportunity offender. No target safe today. Okay, so atheism fails to answer the identity question, the value question, the purpose question. Last question, agency. Can we make a difference? Well, reflecting on this question of can our lives make a difference led Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy, author of War and Peace, to the point in his life when he wrote this as an atheist to an existential crisis that eventually actually led him back to Christian faith. He writes these words. He says, "This question that I'd stumbled across was a question without an answer to which one cannot live, as I'd found by experience. The question was this: what will come of what I am doing today or shall do tomorrow? What will come of my whole life? Differently expressed, the question is, why should I live? Why wish for anything? Why do anything? It can also be expressed this way: is there any meaning in my life that the inevitable death awaiting me does not destroy?" Or to put it in more contemporary terms, I think it was Tim Keller used this illustration once in a sermon where he said, you know, imagine you're standing on the Titanic and it struck the iceberg, it's slipping beneath the waves. In fact, just you and one other passenger standing next to you are the last survivors, and you too are about to slip below the waves. All lifeboats have gone. Even Leonardo DiCaprio has sunk off his bit of wood on which both of them could have fitted anyway, but there we are, let's not go there. And there you are, you're about to die, you've got 30 seconds left of life. And there's the fellow passenger next to you. Well, says Keller, you could punch the guy in the face and steal his wallet, or you could hug him and give him a big embrace. But what difference does it make? Because either way, you are still going to be food for the sharks. And that's what Tolstoy was wrestling with. If there is no God, why change the way you live? Why do anything? And as I say, as he explored the implications of that actually led him to abandon his atheism and rediscover the Christian faith of his youth. And not least, you see, if the conclusions that follow from your starting point are so bizarre, then maybe there's something wrong with your starting point and you ought to find a new one. So to conclude, atheism is a belief system. It is a worldview. It is a religion. And I say that not to mock or belittle atheist friends. Okay, I've used a bit of satire and some humour in the last 40 minutes or so, but sometimes I think that's because humour shatters illusions and helps us see the pretense on things. And the belief that atheism is a non-thing that doesn't need defending is one of the greatest illusions, quite frankly. It's one of the great myths of the modern age, that atheism is not a belief. And to my atheist friends, I just want to say this. I want to say, look, believing, being religious, is part of what being a human being is. I think it's part of the definition of being a human being. We are believing animals. In fact, the French philosopher Julia Kristeva, who's not a Christian as far as I know, wrote a wonderful little book a few years ago called This Incredible Need to Believe, that human beings are wired for belief. To be a human is to be a believer, whether your ultimate belief is in God or in the void, and those beliefs have consequences that can be tested. The interesting thing is, though, I think, some atheists find the idea that atheism is a belief system or a worldview or a religion frightening, because now it means you've got some hard thinking to do. Now you've got to start thinking about it. You can't simply say as an atheist, prove your religion to me, and then sit there and scowl like an immigration officer with a dose of hemorrhoids. Everyone has beliefs that are central for them. Everyone has beliefs that cause actions. Everyone has beliefs that define them. Everyone has beliefs that have implications. And for those kind of beliefs, we can be asked by people who don't think the same as us, give reasons. And if atheists wish to duck that responsibility, then I can do no more than commend them to one of their own, Christopher Hitchens, who said that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. To which I would say, quite right, Christopher, quite right. Amen. Thank you for listening. So we go till 12:30? 12:30. Oh, look at that. We have 17 minutes then to unpack this, make some of it clear. We'll go in completely different directions. Happy to take questions on anything within reason. So yeah, if there's anything I shared today that's you've got you thinking, you want clarification on, didn't make sense, then we'll take questions. Yeah, David.
How do you deal with I'm not trying to reduce everything you just said to not much, but how do you respond to the Twitter comment that you posted near the beginning? Because you haven't got a lot of words.
Yes.
Or a lot of situations in life, it seems there's only a short window.
Yeah, there are. You're quite right, and let me show you the answer to that. Well, certainly yes, it is the answer to that. What we do now is we have this wonderful resource that I think you mentioned actually, called Short Answers. And one reason we created Short Answers was for just that. So if you go to the SOLAS website, solas-cpc.org/short answers, or you stick my name into Facebook and ignore all the rude atheist things that come up. No, I think SOLAS comes up top of the list. We started creating these short videos where we take a common question and then we try and address it in 3 to 4 minutes. Very, very accessible, very shareable, and copyright free. So you can if you want to, you can go to YouTube, download these, pass them around. And so what I've learned is rather than trying to engage on Twitter, you can't because it's a short format. 280 letters now is the most you can use. So I always try and send someone to a resource on Twitter. And if it's not a short answer video, if you found other resources to go, simply say, with respect, I disagree with you, and here's a really good article that will show you why, or here's a video that will show you why. Now, you don't know whether the person will do that. They may deny they've done that, but they may still do it. And of course, Twitter is a public conversation unless they've direct messaged you, in which case other people watching it may go, oh, well, that's interesting. And I've had that happen to me. I've responded to atheists and then had later on a message from somebody else, another atheist, who's gone, oh, I read that article that you recommended to that guy, and that was really interesting. So I would try and direct them to a resource. Facebook is slightly different because it's longer form comments. You can be longer. There I would just try and use the question asking approach. I would say, well, maybe can you explain to me why you think that, and see what they say, rather than leap straight in with going, okay, here's 3,000 words and why atheism is a belief, and actually you're not addressing them. So when there's a longer format, I'd use the same as I would in a coffee shop. I'd say, okay, why do you think that? And they'll either engage or they won't. And if they start being rude to you, well, again, it's Facebook, it's public, and other people can see. And that rarely happens. I've rarely had really angry atheists. Sometimes, but very rarely. I hope that helps a little, David. Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, wonderful. Anybody else? Yes, right at the back, sir. What's your name?
Mike.
Mike.
Yeah. Andy, do you deal with atheists all the time?
Yes.
Do you find that one argument is better than others? Or do you always come back to the thing that you came in with at the end, namely that in the end, that this is kind of if you face them with it, life is meaningless. And can anybody live like that? And things like love and truth and beauty.
Yes.
Is that a good argument?
Yeah.
Do you use it often? Or?
Yes, I do. And so I think I would certainly say I don't have one argument, Mike. Not least, I don't think there is one magic bullet argument. And not least, I always want to be very conscious of that, at the end of the day, arguments only go so far. I was saying to, that's yourself, wasn't it? In the coffee break, we were talking about this and saying that, we mustn't forget to, ultimately it's the work of the Holy Spirit and of Christ drawing people to himself. And C.S. Lewis's friend Austin Farrer, who was a professor at Oxford, had this lovely line where he said, look, arguments can't create faith, but they can create a climate in which faith is possible. So somebody who thinks they have to leave their brains at the door to be a Christian, and that's their stumbling block, if they can see, oh, look, Christians can have intelligent conversation, I can now think more seriously. So there's not a magic bullet, Mike. What I would say, there are themes I keep returning to. First one is where you ended, showing them things that only make sense if Christianity is true. C.S. Lewis talked about signs of transcendence. So, and there's a lot of things you can go different directions there, but it can be quite interesting. So a good example, Wednesday I fly out to Canada and the US for a speaking tour, and one of the places I'm going on that tour that I'm really excited about is I'm going back to Washington, D.C., and I'm speaking at the headquarters of National Geographic. And I did that 2.5 years ago. It was an incredible privilege to do that. And there's a friend of mine there, who's a commissioning editor. And he does this lovely event where 3 or 4 times a year, he invites his colleagues and friends and co-workers, puts a sandwich lunch on, always bribe people with food, right? And then you get an interesting speaker and see what happens. And so he rang me up about 3 years ago when I was in Canada. And in fact, he found my name. He said, would you come and speak at National Geographic? And I said, what do you want to speak on? He said, well, he said, after 17 years of working here, I've concluded 2 things. One, this magazine and the TV channel and everything around National Geographic is the high temple of scientific naturalism. Most of my colleagues believe there is no God, science has answered every question, just atoms, just particles. So on the other hand, we are committed as a magazine and a TV channel and a website and everything, we're committed to beauty. If you've ever picked up a copy of National Geographic or watched a documentary, astonishingly beautiful images, and we pride ourselves on art and beauty. He said, I think those things, art and beauty and everything is just molecules, don't fit. Can you come and bang those 2 ideas together until people shout at you? That's basically what he said to me. So I said, great. So I went to Washington. I remember being in the seminar room before the lunch began, and the first person I talked to introduced himself as an atheist. So again, identity marker. He said, not really into religion, thinks it's all a load of rubbish, really. I said, why are you here? He said, the lunch was good last time. He said, speakers like to be rubbish. I went, I am the speaker. He went, well, we'll see. So anyway, I gave my little talk, and really that was a whole argument about how beauty only makes sense if there is something other than just atoms and particles. Otherwise, why do we stand on a mountain and go, oh, wow, rather than, look at the interesting configuration of photons bouncing off gases in the upper atmosphere or something. That's not our reaction. He was the first person to talk to me, to raise his hand in the Q&A, and say, this has struck me before, he said, but I've sort of not really thought about it. And it turned into what I thought would be a hostile question, this incredibly open question, and then his whole religious background came out. He'd been raised in a very conservative Catholic home, told all questions were off limits, and the science is beaten up on and stuff, and as a young man, he'd thrown all that off, rejected it, and but actually he was asking spiritual questions. And so we did it through one of those have you thought about questions. And the second thing, Mike, sorry it's a long answer, but it was a brilliant question. Second thing is I do the compare and contrast. That's related. This is Christianity, this is the alternative. That is helpful on so many questions. Good example is one of the common questions that comes up is the problem of evil. If we leap straight in and try to explain why we live in a world of evil and suffering, when we believe in a God who's powerful and good, and we just leap straight into that, often I used to find that it was a difficult conversation. But when you've first shown people, go, well, before we talk about Christianity, let's talk about how we might approach that if atheism were true. We can't call anything good. We can't call anything evil. There just is. And at the end of the day, we live in a world of natural selection. And in that kind of world, some people are going to get hurt and some people won't. And the HIV virus has the same right to do its thing in small children in sub-Saharan Africa as you have to do your thing. And paint the bleakness. And go, now let's talk about Christianity. And I then began finding even people who are maybe 85% convinced of what you say here about the cross and what the gospel has to say about evil and suffering are still going, compared to the alternative, this is light years ahead in terms of an answer that works. And even if there are still things I want to think through, I'm far more likely to look at it if I've realized the alternative is bleak. And then lastly, sounds again cliched, but keep bringing it back to Jesus. And I remember really the reflection I came across on this that I've started using recently is, it's interesting, right, that what the word gospel means. We throw the word gospel around a lot as evangelicals, right? The gospel, the gospel, the gospel. But I think sometimes we forget what it means, and certainly our non-Christian friends have no idea what the word gospel. They know we use it, but what does it mean? And so I love unpacking that on university campuses, because obviously as good leaders and pastors and theologians, I'm sure this morning, you all know what the word gospel means. What does the word gospel mean? Thank you. Exactly. English translation of the Greek word euangelion, right? What news is interesting, right? When you come to a news event, the only question is, did it happen? And does it mean what I think it means? So we don't approach a news event and analyze it philosophically. We ask, is it true? So if the example I often give to, on university campuses, I say, look, 30th of August, 1997, told you the story earlier, I asked my wife my then girlfriend to marry me. She said yes. Imagine I ring up a friend at Oxford University who's studying analytic philosophy, and I tell him, in excited tones over the phone, that the most beautiful woman in the world has agreed to marry me, and there was no alcohol or bribery involved. And his first response is to go, oh, okay, let us analyse the propositional statement Andy Bannister is now engaged using modal logic and the linguistics of Wittgenstein and a whole series of other things. I'd have to say, mate, you've missed something, because we're not talking about a proposition, we're talking about a piece of news, not a suggestion, not a concept, not a piece of advice, it's news, and only two things matter. Did it happen, and does it mean what I think it means? Because if it does, the whole world changes, because I've now gone from being a single person to being engaged, and married life is opening up in front of me. And the gospel works that way. That's Jesus, good news. Either it happened, and it means what we think it does, or it didn't. And if it happened, everything changes. So that's where I like to end on university campuses, confronting people with Jesus and trying to reframe it. So they're not thinking propositionally. Becoming a Christian is not sort of coldly, logically, clinically looking at the statement, Jesus rose from the dead, and processing it and saying, yes, that happened, a bit like Mr. Spock. It's about going, oh gosh, this happened, and this was real, and he was who he said he was, and therefore everything changes. So, yeah, signs of transcendence, compare and contrast, good news. That's the framework I tend to use, Mike, for everything. Sorry it's a longish answer, but I think it's such for me, such an important question you asked. Thank you. Okay, we still have 7 minutes left, even after me giving Mike a 10-minute, $100 answer there. So if there's anybody else, I promise you not every answer will be at that length. It was just such a good question. Yes, sir, what's your name?
Brian.
Brian, far away, Brian.
Do you think atheism is or has percolated down to people who don't read books or anything? The man on the street?
Yes. Okay, has atheism percolated down to the man in the street? Yes, is the very simple answer. When I was writing The Atheist Didn't Exist, that kind of engages with Hitchens and Harris and Dawkins and has some fun with them and shows how it's utterly ridiculous, but does so hopefully gracefully. I went towards the end of it thinking to myself, is this a spent force? I mean, by the time I was writing that, 2014, that's 8 years on from the God delusion. And the conclusion I came to is exactly what you've identified. Yes, although the new atheism is perhaps running out of cultural energy, the arguments have gone everywhere. So if you were to grab your average British person and say, hey, do you think religion is a good thing or a bad thing? Most of them are going to go, I think it's a bad thing, causes problems, right? If you were to ask people, do you think science explains everything? The fact that Brian Cox can come out with that on BBC or whatever it was on and not get challenged, not having them go, hey, what did you just say? Whereas, the philosopher in me is going, somebody needs to go, what? That's the most ridiculous thing we've ever heard. Brian Cox, either defend it or shut up. It's a lunatic statement. But everyone goes, oh yes, Brian Cox, isn't that lovely? So I love your language. It's percolated down. The great thing in that, because most people don't read and think, when you encounter somebody who says, I think science can explain everything, or I think religion is the cause of all wars, or whatever, a great starting point before launching into a massive answer is to say, why do you think that? What evidence? I'm really interested by that idea. What's led you to that conclusion? Because usually you'll find the answer is nothing. But the fact you've answered the question gently exposing, you haven't even mentioned the word God, you haven't even given your own position away. Many people, I think, forget that making arguments is like building a house. If you're going to build a house, you build foundations, walls, and then put the roof on the top. If you just put the roof on the top with nothing around it, it's going to get... And I think people do that with atheistic arguments. Oh yeah, there's, science proves everything. Well, it's not an argument, that's just a proposition. And we live in an age, I think, where social media has caused people also to think in sound bites. So yeah, we can ask people why. So it's percolated down. So this stuff is really, really important. And we see, people come across it at work. I mean, students coming across it at university. Even getting it, is interesting in, having friends whose kids are getting exposed to it in primary school. And stuff, just this sort of attitude from people. So yeah, I think we need to train our people to engage it, train our young people to respond to it, and then go out and meet atheists when we encounter them, and just gently go, explain to me why you think these things, and then point the way to Christ. Thanks, Brian. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Steve.
Steve, good name. Why did I say that? I don't know. It is a good name, Steve, but yeah. Sorry, it just came to me, Steve.
My parents
Oh, Chris is on it. Why do you believe that?
My parents thought so.
Yes.
Just picking up on that point.
Yes.
one of the things I run into in talking with people who may first of all say I'm an atheist is that when you push back at that and try and open up that with using some of the arguments you mentioned there, they just change from being, oh, well, maybe I'm more of an agnostic then. And so it's like, it doesn't, I don't really care whether you call me an atheist or an agnostic. So I just, what I don't want is your Christianity. So actually I'm using the point of being either an atheist or an agnostic or anything else, my own kind of syncretistic, pick and mix religion, just to push you off.
Push your way, exactly.
And so therefore, even that 2.5% was it of the world population that's atheist? Really? I mean, I'm thinking there might even be smaller than that.
It's interesting, isn't it, Steve? I say you're absolutely right, and I think you see this all over the place. The place I saw it most recently, I don't know if anybody here saw, there was a big survey done. I forget who did it now. I went around, it's been going around on social media in the last few weeks about the religious beliefs of people in, I think it was Ligonier, thank you. Yes, I was going to say it's American ministry. But it only takes a moment to look at those stats to go, huh? It's something like, 30% of people in the UK don't believe in God, but then 80% believe in some kind of afterlife. You're like, what? So it tells you people are vary all over the place. Sometimes that's just confusion, Steve, I think, to be generous to people. Sometimes I think it is, I don't want your religion. So there's a couple of things I would suggest at least trying, or maybe 3 things, actually. Good Baptist, always thinking 3s. The first I would say is, it's interesting, but the whole atheism agnosticism question, i.e. there isn't or I'm not sure, I mean, doesn't it really depend on how important the question is? So an analogy, right, I would say to that person, I'd say, so let's imagine, Steve, that you and I were tasked with demolishing an old hospital, and you're my supervisor, and you go, okay, Andy, your job, you're going to go through the building very carefully, because we want to make sure there are no people still in there, because there might still be some old people, some patients. We want to make sure this building is empty before we blow it up and, cause chaos. So I come whistling back to you 5 minutes later and go, oh, yeah, done it, boss. I don't think there's anybody there. I don't think there's anybody still in the building. Would you press the button, Steve? Would you press the button at that point going, Bannister has taken 5 minutes to go, I don't think there's anybody there. On the other hand, if I come back after 8 hours, you go, where have you been? I went through every room. I went into every corner. I checked everywhere. There is no one in the building. It's okay. I think most of us, if we're in that position, we go, okay, I will now press the button because my team, my colleague has done the right job rather than this flippant. So I think there's something similar with atheism and agnosticism. Does it matter? If the God question is irrelevant, it doesn't really matter. But is it life-changingly important? If it is, then I think we need a little bit more than just agnosticism. Which leads me to the second thing I like to say to people who play the agnostic game. They're going, look, there's 2 types of agnostic. You can be a bone-idle, lazy agnostic who is just saying, I don't know, because you just can't be bothered to find out. Well, at least name that for what it is. Just say, I'm lazy, I can't be bothered. At least we can be honest. On the other hand, this is where you can be rhetorically clever. You can go, there's also a very wise form of agnosticism. And I've known you for a few years, my friend, and I'm sure this far more describes where you're at. No one's going to go for the first option. And that's the kind of person who goes, look, I don't know, but I want to know. I want to know. I just haven't found out the answer, but I'm open to finding the answer because I want to find the truth. And I've got a lot of respect for that kind of agnosticism. And of course, interestingly, so did Jesus, actually, because Jesus loved that kind of openness. Jesus said, those who seek will find. He had huge amounts of time for people who were open. Which will bring me to the third point of saying, look, if they've said it, great. If they haven't said it, even to name it and go, look, some people use agnosticism because they're afraid of organized religion. They don't want anything to do with the church. And to say, look, I understand that. I could give a defense to some of the church. I think there's some great things going on. But I also understand why people feel like that. I guess if I was in your shoes, I would, because particularly the media tells the bad stuff, and there has been some bad stuff. Let's not paper over it. The church at times has behaved appallingly. We haven't lived up to the standard of the one who we follow. But it's interesting, though, if your issue for not wanting to consider Christianity is you don't like the damage religion does, I just don't know if you've realized how close to Jesus you're now standing. Because Jesus spent all of his time attacking religious people. He goes for the Pharisees. He argues of that very issue, and he goes chasing after those who want nothing to do with religion because they've been cast out. So I would say, interesting, my friend. Have you looked at Jesus? Have you talked more closely? And I find that theme resonates with with people. I mean, we're very clear. I think that, I don't want to beat up on the church. The church is God's design for reaching society. But equally, don't feel you defend everything, so we lose the person and go, yeah, I think we can critique ourselves, but that Jesus makes that critique. So I'd sort of do that. I'd explore agnosticism and atheism. I'd tease them a bit on what kind of agnostic, and then I'd find ways of gently connecting it to Jesus. But I also know, Steve, when to shut up as well, because if they are genuinely a bit nervous, having you going too strong, to perhaps sow a few seeds, put a stone in their shoe, and then kind of see next time you speak. Thanks for that. We are at 12:30, but there was one question about, have we got time to do one last one, if that's okay with people? Yeah, what's your name, sir? Nigel. Fire away, Nigel.
Very similar to the last one.
Yes.
The people who just are dumbed down by
Yes.
media, television,
Yeah.
they are the lazy ones that
Yeah.
you're speaking about.
Yes.
How on earth do we even get them to think about Christ?
Yeah, I mean, no, I think the interesting thing, Nigel, in one sense, that, that's a question on my heart very much that I haven't fully got an answer to, because I think I share your frustration that I think we live in a culture that encourages people to think shallowly. I mean, the fact that, the question of who snogged who outside a cafe, for Strictly Come Dancing was our main headlines for a week, 1 week. I'm like, okay, what's going on? And there's the old saying from the last days of the Roman Empire, the bread and circuses idea. That fling food to the poor and give them entertainment in the Colosseum so they don't ask the questions. And we live in a culture that I think operates that way. I think one thing we can try and do is try and expose that actual issue, and there are some great resources for doing that aren't necessarily Christian. So there was an amazing book written about 25 years ago called "Amusing Ourselves to Death" by Neil Postman. I often find ways of weaving Neil's work into conversation, because I think actually more people recognise the shallowness issue than you may realise. I've had conversations with neighbours and friends around that issue. That's the starting point. And then you can gently go to, but why does it matter to be deep? And now we're on to the edge of spiritual questions. Or there's on technology, there's a wonderful writer called Nicholas Carr, who wrote a book called The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Minds. Amazing, amazing, amazing book. And again, I've recommended that to people, and it's been a great conversation starter, I love the way that you can use stuff like this as conversation starters, even though Nick is sympathetic to spiritual things, but is not a Christian. So I think maybe address that particular issue. And then I think maybe the answer is, and this is a half-formed answer, I confess, because I'm working this out myself in my own life, my own friends. I think try and find those ways to build depth. Build friendships that are deep. Okay, we can't hit everybody, but you and I can try and form relationships of depth with our neighbours. We can try and find ways of slowing down. Like, I'm an outdoors person, so I love taking people for walks. That's an obvious, great, we get 2 hours together in the mountains to talk rather than a 5-minute Twitter conversation. Can you find ways to build depth in? And as if you're a church leader, how do you encourage that in our congregations? Because I wonder if it starts with Christians, actually, that we're caught up in the rat race and the hamster wheel, and so we're going, and therefore we're not able to engage with others and help them slow down. So how do we help our people learn to slow down and just breathe? And how do we learn them to then build relationships of depth with others? But I think you've definitely identified one of the big questions of the age. And I think it's not just affecting the church, it's affecting politics, it's affecting civil society. It's one of the drives behind identity politics. We're so shallow that people are clinging on to the only thing they can find, which is some fragment of identity that you can hold on to because it's meaningful in a raging tide. And I think maybe if Christians were more part of that conversation. But yeah, thank you for that. So on that note, I think that kind of brings everything from my side to an end. Just to say, do check out the Solas website. And I was just going to show you, I've just lost that's the danger of flipping between slide decks, isn't it? I was just going to say, if you like the kind of work that we do, particularly the evangelism, this is training. We spend 80% of our time doing evangelism. We can only do what we do as an organisation with people supporting us up and down the country. And we have this little thing we do. We ask people to go to the website, and you can sign up to support Solas for as little as £3 a month. Really, it really is all we ask. That's the price of a coffee in Starbucks. And in return for that, we will send you as a gift this wonderful book. It's got chapters on all manner of things to do with evangelism and apologetics. I'm in here, David Robertson's in here, lots of others in here as a thank you. But also you'll know that you're helping us spend most of our time in front of non-Christian audiences. Because the great thing is Christian audiences like you folks will kindly reimburse our costs and pay honoraria and all those kind of things. Atheists don't tend to do that. They don't kind of pay us to come. So we can only do that because of Christians. So if one or two of you would consider solascpc.org book offer, and that would be appreciated. Thank you for your time. It's been great spending time with you this morning. Of all the audiences I've ever addressed, you are the most recent. Said I should pray. I was going to let David pray, but he doesn't pray on Mondays apparently, so deal with David later. Father God, we thank you that we've been able to take time out from busy lives and schedules to come and spend time together and think through some of these issues. And we thank you for the ability to do that. Thank you too that we live in a country where we are free to do that for all of its problems. We're reminded in the news right now of some of our friends live in countries like Pakistan where that is not very much the case. And so thank you we have these freedoms, and I pray especially you encourage us to use our freedoms for the gospel. So often, as Nigel's last question reminded us, as Christians, we just drink from the well of media, we enjoy all the digital trinkets, but we don't think deeply or engage deeply. And so, Lord, would we reflect on what we've heard this morning and things you've laid on our hearts? Pray that you might call to our minds atheist friends, skeptical friends that we should be sharing our faith with, but especially for those of us who have responsibilities for leading and teaching others, would you help us take what we've learned this morning and pass it on to our congregations to help equip them, motivate them, resource them to be sharing their faith more effectively. Lord, we thank you for all those Christian brothers and sisters we have who are in the workplace, who Monday through Friday are out there mixing with secular friends and colleagues who are right out there in the middle of the harvest field. Would you help us equip them so they can be salt and light ambassadors for Christ in the place that you've placed them? We ask all this in the precious name of Jesus Christ, the reason we do all of these things. In his name, amen.